So good evening. The real question is, why are we here? In other words, what are we here for and what are we not here for? In other words, what's the purpose of this class? You see, typically, and especially the fact that it's being held in a synagogue is just because this is a space that I have easy access to without having to lay out money or pull some strings, pull some connections in order to have the class, to hold a class. But if typically it's in a synagogue, oh, this is going to be a class on Judaism. No, it's not. Or this is a class to attract people to Judaism, to recruit people to Judaism. No, it's not. In fact, you know that one of the basic tenets of Judaism is that we do not recruit anyone to Judaism. In fact, we try to discourage people to change who they are, to change what they are in order to become Jews. And that's really what this class is about. No, it's not a conversion class at all. Not only it's not a conversion class, but I think this class will prove somewhat a failure if that's what it leads to all the participants, which now, of course, we're just a small group. But the idea is for it to lead to, God willing, a bigger and wider audience, not only here physically in this premise, but also through the various technologies that are available. So the question is then, why am I and my colleague Rab Asher, why are we, as obvious, I can't hide it, obvious rabbis, why are we then offering these classes? In other words, what is this all about? What's the gimmick here? What's the agenda? Okay? So somebody with a Coca-Cola shirt is selling soda, you assume that what they're selling is Coca-Cola. Imagine that they're trying to push Pepsi. Just something doesn't seem right? You're working for the Coca-Cola Corporation, you're not selling Pepsi. And if you work for the Pepsi Corporation, you're not selling Coca-Cola. It just doesn't make sense. That's not what you would be doing. Or you'd put on that uniform. I obviously have a natural uniform just because the way I look, my kippah, and so on. So why am I teaching this class? What do I want from here? In other words, what's the agenda? To put it in two simple, plain and simple sentences, the agenda is to provide the knowledge, and therefore the proper tools, the potential, for anyone that wants, and hopefully all want, to get closer to God and have a meaningful and fulfilled life. To live a fulfilled life. But that answers what we're hoping to do, what our objectives are. But why am I doing it? Or why would another rabbi be doing it? And the answer is, let's go back to the beginning. We all know that perhaps the most, second to the creation of the world, the most monumental event in all of history, the history of the world, there's no other history, is what? Mount Sinai. The revelation on Mount Sinai. Right? God created the world. That's groundbreaking. No pun intended, but He created the ground. He made the heavens. He made the world. Otherwise, you and I not only wouldn't be talking, we wouldn't be existing. We wouldn't be. So God created the world. I think the next monumental event is Mount Sinai, the revelation. God appears, and guess what? He finally says what He wants. You guys have been playing around all these years, but let me tell you what I really want from you. So it seems. But there's a little problem. Think about it for a second. If that's what He really wanted, in other words, He's finally, I know it took Him so long, but after, 2,448 years, that's exactly the timeline from creation. He finally appears on Mount Sinai and says, okay, guys, I'll give out the secret. I'll give you the list of rules here and instructions. Yeah? Imagine you get a electronic apparatus, no instructions, something brand new, and you're just tinkering with it for that many years, and finally somebody shows up and says, let me show you. Here's the button. Here's the... It doesn't make sense. Not only doesn't it make sense, but think of it now. If indeed God was revealing himself so he can give us the instructions, so he can tell us what he wants from us after all this time, what the purpose of all of this is, then why only to a small little tiny intimate group of people, which were never intended to be anything more than perhaps 1 or 2% of the world population. As much as God said to Abraham and Jacob and Isaac, your children will be like the stars and like the dust, it doesn't necessarily mean in numbers, or certainly not until the end of time. Even if. In fact, the Torah itself, the Bible itself says, Ki atem hama'at mikol ha'amim, for you are the minority of all nations. That's not saying, it didn't work out, so you're the least. God's saying, this is what you guys are designed to be. You're not meant to be the majority, certainly not all of civilization, of the population of the world. Why then would God appear to a small little homogeneous group of people and tell them finally what he wants and leave out the rest of the world? Does that make sense? Does that make sense? It doesn't make sense. It's obvious, right? It's obvious that that cannot be what happened and what God intended to happen there. That's not what happened. Furthermore, let's take it back now. 2,448 years the world exists. So much happened. Some good, a lot of bad, which even the Torah itself, the Bible itself relates. How even at some points it became so bad that God had to, for lack of a better way of saying it, press a reset button in the form of the flood. Or was it Tower of Babel and destroy and entire populations, flood the world? There was many, many different things that happened up until that point that the Jews leave Egypt and receive this revelation at Mount Sinai. Does it make sense that such a wonderful God, the creator of the world, would create an entire universe for absolutely no purpose and give him no direction? And finally, when he decides, or so it seems, when he decides to give them some instruction, he only gives it to a select few. It doesn't make sense. Yeah. Logically, it doesn't make sense. Even the worst dictator still at some level does have a desire for his people, for his constituents, to have a basic good life, to have basic good stuff, maybe less than he has, but to have something. Would it make sense that such a benevolent God would just allow people to just kind of just be, just exist, without direction, without meaning, without any whatsoever purpose, without any whatsoever meaning? And then worse, at a certain point, gets so angry with them, and he just punishes them. I mean, would you do it to your children? Never gave them instructions, never taught them, never directed them what you expected them, what time do you expect them to go to sleep, or how you expect them to sit by the table, and then when they don't do it right, just suddenly, just get angry and just, God forbid, get abusive. Well, you just heard it. That's abuse. It's abuse. It doesn't make sense. So I made my case. It's logical. It's just so obvious that God did indeed give mankind direction, purpose. They may have quickly forgotten about it. They may have conveniently ignored it and put it behind them. And God wasn't standing there every moment and waving a wand. It came a certain point that yes, a reset was necessary. A reset was unfortunately mandatory. If it wouldn't have been, God wouldn't have done it. The flood obviously was mandatory. There was a reason. If God had other options, I think he's a lot better than us at choosing his options. So obviously it came to that point. But Up to that point, there obviously was an expectation that mankind was, or at least should have been, aware of. Otherwise, how does God just come in and punish them? That's abuse. It's just ridiculous. It doesn't make sense. Furthermore, we do know, and it's recorded in the Torah, that God spoke to Adam, God spoke to Noah. We know there were other great righteous men who lived, and certainly women too. But those who are mentioned in the Torah, we have Hanoch, Methuselah, or Methuselah, Hanoch and Methuselah. You're talking about righteous people. So there were people who understood what God expected from them, and perhaps they had even a following, but unfortunately, most of the population ignored it. And that's due to also a very special and benevolent, absolutely benevolent gift that God gave us, which unfortunately we as humans terribly use to our detriment. And that is the gift of free choice. But that gift of free choice is unfortunately what led man to stray and to do whatever they chose to do and then go off, in crazy directions, which are, like I said before, unfortunately brought to the reset of the flood and so on. But at least we've established the fact that certainly, beyond any doubt, God gave direction to people. Not only he gave direction and instructions, do this, don't do that, but it also makes sense. And I want you to think of it from this perspective. The Midrash is the, so to speak, backstory that you don't find explicitly in the Torah, sometimes not even explicitly in the Talmud, but it's the story behind the story. Midrash gives us, and of course it's been passed down from generation to generation, Midrash gives us a little insight and explains to us, based on a verse, that the entire existence of the world is based exclusively on what? Kindness. As there is a verse that says, Olam, which means the world, Chesed Yibaneh, is built by kindness. Now what does that mean? So the Midrash says that God had a desire. I know whatever that means. I know what it means when I have a desire, when you have a desire, but whatever that means, that might be a borrowed term. What does it mean, the divine has a desire? But let's leave it. Let's just take it at the face value of what it's saying. When God desired to be benevolent to his creatures, that's when he created the world. In other words, so to speak, God had no choice. He had this burning desire to do kindness. In order to do kindness, you need to have whom to do it to. Right? If you want to be benevolent, you have to have someone to give to help. Even if the person doesn't need it, but at least you give them, you feel good, you feel kind, like you're doing kindness. So that's why God created the world. So imagine this whole thing is like one big game. This is God's Toys R Us. Okay? He built this whole thing because he wanted to play this game of kindness. Now I ask you, would it make sense that he wanted to do kindness? That's what triggered his desire to make the world. That's what triggered his will to get involved in this whole messed up game. And then all he would leave us with is just some rules. Don't do this, do that, do that. Leave me alone. And have just the most chosen of all the creatures. What makes us different than all God's creatures? Our intellect. Our ability to think, our ability not only to comprehend, but our ability to imagine. So to leave us going aimlessly for thousands of years without any purpose, and then even after giving us the Torah, the revelation at Mount Sinai, continue to hold 98 or 99% of the world population of humans, again, in aimless direction, without any purpose other than, don't do this, don't do that, don't do that. Don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery, and what else? That's it, and have a meaningless life and get out of my way. Obviously, that can't be the case. It can't. That's not benevolence. You see, for an animal to live a life where no one bothers it, no one steals from it, and it only gets food, it gets sustenance, it gets nice weather, whatever climate it's used to and it needs, whatever climate God created it to be in. That's benevolence. Because it cannot think outside of a certain capacity. It does not have that capacity. It doesn't have the need for anything more. Imagine somebody has a pet, beautiful dog, and you bought him a beautiful Rolls Royce. It doesn't make a difference to the dog. It's not benevolence, and it's not lack of benevolence if that dog doesn't even own a car. Why? Because it doesn't need it. It doesn't have the appreciation of these things, so it doesn't need it. But a human being that does have a mind, God gave us a mind, God gave us ability to think, God gave us the ability to imagine, and God gave us the ability and need for fulfillment, for meaning. Anybody that is half normal, you're a half average human being, certainly more than half average, certainly more than average, has a need to have meaning in life, to have purpose. Correct? So it's obvious that although we already made and we established the fact that God must have given them rules all the way in the beginning, that He also gave them direction. He also gave them the means for meaning, for fulfillment. Do you agree with that?
Yeah.
It makes sense, right? And it's not such an, I don't have to be overwhelmingly compelling in my argument. It's so obvious and makes sense. If God created the world for kindness, then He gave us the ability to enjoy it. For a human being ultimately to enjoy life is not just to have another piece of steak, and not just to have another vacation. These are important things. We need them because we have, which, one of the courses we'll study, we have an animalistic part, which we need to feed to. Yeah, we need that. We have the animal part of us, but that's not who we are. That's just another component, okay? That's another component. To use the metaphor, we all drive cars, right? The windows in the car is an important component in the car, but it's not the sum total of the car. What really is the most important part of the car is the engine, the transmission. I'm not a mechanic, whatever, but the parts that really make the car move and function, right? So you don't scrap your car because the radio doesn't work the sound system, correct? That's not the most important part of the car. So our animalistic part is a part of us, but that's not who we are. We are more the spiritual, the emotional, the psychological person that we are. That's what really defines and separates the human being. And for that, it's obvious that God gave purpose. God gave direction. God said what He wants, but He also gave us the means to enjoy it, because that's our ultimate enjoyment. Our ultimate enjoyment is things that bring us satisfaction, not just animalistic satisfaction, but human satisfaction, spiritual, emotional, psychological satisfaction. And that God gave us. And that He gave to all mankind. And that's perhaps also the reason why at the same time, think of it this way, just as an example, He also gave us what I would call the safeguards. Because He gave us the means to enjoy spirituality, enjoy God, enjoy purpose, enjoy meaning, but that can very quickly stray off the path and become, unfortunately, unfolded into paganism, idol worship, and so on and so forth, as it did. That's why God now gave us, don't worship idols, believe in one God, and things like that, to help us. But He still didn't take away our free choice, which explains for the deterioration, the very quick deterioration of mankind. So basically, we sum that all up. There is definitely a purpose in life. There is definitely meaning in life, even prior to Mount Sinai. Even prior to Mount Sinai. When God revealed Himself on Mount Sinai, what He did ostensibly is, He selected a small group of people. Why is a whole separate discussion. But he selected a group of people. I mean, in plain simple words, the reason is because they're descendants of Abraham. And Abraham was the first one to stand up and say, I am going to teach the people. I am going to make a difference. I am going to show the world that there is meaning, that there is purpose. And being his descendants, they merited to this special revelation and their special mission. The charge of saying, you guys are going to help the rest of humanity. You guys are now given the responsibility, and at the same time it's a privilege, it's a special merit, to teach the rest of the world, help them come closer to find, or as close as possible, to finding meaning, to finding purpose, to finding that happiness, that pleasure in being alive, in being human. There's no greater pleasure than having fulfillment. And because you guys are that select group, and I'm not, God forbid, what I'm going to say now, I'm not, God forbid, saying this literally, but just for lack of a better term, because you're going to become this elite group, again, not that Jews are better than anyone or not. Jews have their way of serving God because that's what God wants for them. Everybody else has their way because that's what God has for them. But they are responsible, that's the Jews, are responsible for seeing to it that the rest of the world lives a life of fulfillment and meaning. And therefore, I'm going to give you a unique and exclusive set of rules because you guys have to answer to a higher standard because you are charged with this higher, what I would call this higher mission, this higher purpose of not only taking care of yourself and finding meaning for yourself, but taking care of the whole world. Okay? So it's almost like this. And if anybody knows anything about lighting, okay, and I know things have changed, but I'm using this as a metaphor. When you put in LED lights, it's not such a problem. But if anybody remembers the old halogen lights, yeah, you had to be very careful. Remember the halogen bulbs? They gave out a tremendous amount of light, even greater than the LED lights. They became very hot. But the problem is, you couldn't touch it with your finger because it was so sensitive. You leave just the body oils that's on your finger on it, and that would burn the light up because it became too intense. The heat was burning it, and now it was detrimental to the light bulb. So this sensitive light bulb, which is so powerful and so strong, had to have a special set of rules versus the regular incandescent bulb where touch it, don't touch it, it's dirty, it's not dirty. It wasn't so unique. It wasn't so refined. So think of the Jew that way. Because we were charged with such an important and exclusive role, therefore God gives us more rules because we have to be careful about more things. But it doesn't mean that suddenly we became the uber human versus the rest of the world population, because that wouldn't make sense. That's not benevolence. Remember, we go back to the point, God created the world with benevolence, with kindness. That's not kind to suddenly take a group. It's like, anyone here parents? You take one child and you favor one child over the other? That's not kindness. We may do it because of our shortcomings, but if we're cognitive about what we're doing, we wouldn't do it. Because why would you now pit the kids one against the other, or a few against one, and make a favorite? You know, when you're in a class, who doesn't remember the class, the teacher's pet? It was a problem, both for the teacher's pet and for everyone else, and for the entirety of the class. It wouldn't make sense for God to do it. So He wouldn't just pick us out as an exclusive group to make us better than everyone. It's just because we were charged with a certain mission, with a certain purpose, with a certain narrative that we have to follow. So therefore God gave us special rules because we're a little, let's just say, more hypersensitive because of the role that we have to play. Does that sit well? Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? Yes. Any questions? No. Okay. So in conclusion, I think I made my argument. I think even faster than I thought I would make it, right? There's definitely meaning. there's definitely a lot of sense in being human. And there's a lot of enjoyment and pleasure. I'm talking about spiritual pleasure to be had. I'm not selling a resort. I'm not selling a vacation package here. When I say pleasure, I mean there's a lot of pleasure, and which is the ultimate pleasure, intellectual and spiritual pleasure to be had in being a human being. And no, you do not have to convert to Judaism. In fact, I would make an argument that you have to not convert to Judaism in order to attain that pleasure. Now, if somebody has an individual need or reason or want even, which is a true want, to become Jewish, in other words, change who they are, then that's fine. That may be their calling and what they need, and perhaps that might be the right thing. But I'm speaking now in general terms. In general terms, if you think of it this way, if one concludes that the only way to find true fulfillment, true closeness to God, is to convert, that in a sense is actually disrespecting God. Because you know what that's saying? That the way God created me, the plan that He had, the path that He put me on, is wrong. It doesn't work. And the proof is that in order for me to make it work, I got to go that way. It doesn't mean, I am not excluding, because the Torah does talk about conversion, and there is a room for it when it comes to that, or if it comes to that. What I'm arguing is that for the sum total of the entire world population, that's not necessary. Not only it's not necessary, it's necessary not. Because it doesn't make sense that God would create a whole population that the only way for them to find perfection is to become something else than what they are. To convert from what they are. Does that make sense? So therefore, the objective of this class and this series that we'll put out and all this study, and we will grow, we will evolve, of course, based on the need, based on the feedback, it's a give and take. That the hope is to learn, to grow, and of course to glean from all the wisdom of Judaism. And when I say wisdom of Judaism and the teachings of Judaism, what I really mean, again, is not to become Jewish, and not that it's really exclusively Jewish. It's really as God gave it to the Jews and said, here, teach it to the people. Now, there's some of the things that God gave to the Jews, which is not, quote, teachable to the rest of the world. Not because the Jews are better, but because it doesn't belong to them. They don't need that for fulfillment. They don't need to have that for fulfillment. Because they don't need to have that, what I would call those special safeguards, because they're in a special elite mission. Okay? Think of it this way. Your average police officer is in law enforcement. He or she not only could, but should and has to wear their name tag and be identifiable. A, as a police officer, and B, as in the individual police officer they are with their badge number, or, I grew up in Brooklyn, in New York. Not only do they have their name on their lapel, but there's a badge number. If you don't remember the name, you remember the badge number. Okay, so if something goes awry, you have a badge number. You have someone to identify. But there's other forms of law enforcement, which is no more, and certainly no less important than your average police officer, law enforcement officer, which is an undercover agent. He or she has to take more precautions. He or she hides their identity. He or she lives almost a hidden life because of the application of what they are doing, their function in law enforcement. But in the sum total, they're all serving the same purpose. They're serving society. And in fact, who knows? The average police officer in some ways may be in more danger, have more duties, have a more difficult task, and in some ways the undercover officer has, more danger in certain ways and a more difficult task. But in the sum total, they're all serving the same purpose. That you have to the undercover agent and so on. And then certainly not to the CIA agent and the FBI agent. My point is that the fact that I need it to sink in with myself and with you, my audience, the fact that the Jewish people have a different set of rules, or I won't call it different, I'll call it a greater set of rules with more detail and more intricacies, does not mean that the average person, the average human being, is serving less of a purpose in terms of connectivity to God. Because if that was the case, then once again, we're going back to the same problem. That's not a benevolent God. Why would you favor one over the other? It's just that because we have this task, this special mission, we need to have another set of rules because of this mission. We need to have another set of observances and customs that are tailored for that particular mission that we have. And that is to be a light to all mankind. Like I told you about that sensitive bulb. It gives off so much light, but it's very sensitive. And that's why, just for example, people sometimes say to me, Rabbi, I know why, or I can understand why certain foods are not kosher. It's not healthy. I said there's nothing that can be further from the truth. I don't accept it. And I'll give you proof for it. Let's, for example, take a very common tenet of kashrut, of the kosher dietary laws, not to mix milk and meat. If anybody wants to tell me, foolishly and absurdly, that a cheeseburger is dangerous for your health, I'm not talking about in the long term with building up cholesterol, I'm talking about just eating the cheeseburger, then how is it that there are billions of people eating cheeseburgers and they're not dying on impact? In fact, I think Burger King, McDonald's, all the other burger joints are all flourishing, they're all doing well, good business, and you don't see ambulances pulling up after every time somebody buys a cheeseburger, right? Or bites into one. So it's not because of that. So why can't the Jew eat a cheeseburger? I mean, what's with God? It tastes good, and I've been told many times, Rabbi, you don't know what a cheeseburger tastes like. They're right. I don't. At this point, I don't want to know what it tastes like. But obviously, God said, you're that sensitive bulb. You're not better than anyone. In fact, if you think of it from this perspective, I'm not serving me. The bulb is not there to serve itself. The bulb is there to serve everybody in the room, everybody who's enjoying the light. So in fact, you can say, if anything, the Jew has the short end of the deal. He can't do this, he can't do that, he can't do that, because he's so sensitive, because he has to give off light to the world. He has to teach the world. You, every single person in the world, that's the purpose of God's creation. And that is the premise of what we call the 7 Noahite laws. But it's not just 7 laws, because if you just looked at the 7 laws, that goes back to what I said before, don't do this, don't do that, that's all? For that you created the whole world? There's meaning, there's purpose. It's just that the Jewish people at Mount Sinai were charged with, here is your rules, here's your regulations, here is your deeper purpose, here's your teacher's training, So now you can go and teach the world. You can now be screwed into those sockets and give off the light. But there's sensitivity, you got to make sure, we got an electrician here, you got to make sure that it's grounded, you got to make sure that it's clean, you got to make sure there's no shorts to the wires, there's no crossing, everything is proper. And then the world becomes a harmonious place. Everything comes together, and the benevolence of God is realized. It materializes. Everybody has purpose, everybody has meaning, everybody's smiling because they're serving God. And yes, you can have cheeseburgers and still serve God. That's the answer. Correct? So that basically makes sense. So I just to summarize, we're not here at all, absolutely not, to convert anyone. On the contrary, would totally discourage it, because it's not necessary based on the argument that I made before. And we're just here to do our job, to teach Torah to non-Jews. And when I say non-Jews, it really is for lack of a better term. I really should be to teach Torah to humans. Or to God's people. We're all God's people. Adam didn't have a synagogue, and of course he didn't have a church. He believed in God. He heard from God, so he knew that it's real. His son already, well, that's a whole different story, right? But we all come from there. We all come from Adam and Eve. We all have a purpose. I do want to share one more point just to conclude. The question is, why now? To summarize my whole argument that I made, is that when we received the revelation at Mount Sinai, it was for the purpose of what? Giving us our marching orders. Go teach the world. Go tell them what to do. Go give them, the purpose, the meaning. Look throughout Jewish history. I think very rarely, if most probably not even at all, do we find that Jews should be engaged in exactly what we're doing right now. So I'll tell you, where I belong to the Chabad movement, and the Rebbe actually is the one who encouraged this. Otherwise I wouldn't be doing it. I'm not going to lie to you. It was the Rebbe who pushed it, and he's the inspiration for this. And he actually spoke about it in the 80s. And as time built on more and more, even very close to his passing in 94. And the Rebbe, when he began pushing this idea, imagine, for most Jews, this is like, so I tell everybody, listen, if you want to be fulfilled, you're going to have to figure a way to fly to Mars. How do I do that? I never heard of that. I believe you, Rabbi, but where do I begin? And why now? My ancestors didn't have to fly to Mars to fulfillment. That's what it sounded like. So the Rebbe explained. And again, certainly, he revealed a little compared to what he knows, to what he knew. But this is what the Rebbe shared. At least, to the scope of my understanding. That if you look throughout history, it's clear, it's obvious, not from any, deep idealistic thinking, but from the facts, that for whatever reason, we don't know, only God knows, maybe the great righteous know, God knows, but for the facts that speak for themselves, that prove that Jews were not given the ability, the opportunity, and therefore the responsibility to actually implement it. In other words, because of all the persecution throughout the generations, even at the best of times, when Jews lived in peace and tranquility, which was typically very short-lived, and really the only utopian time, which in some ways actually is compared to the times that will be after the Messiah comes, after Mashiach comes, is the era of King Solomon. And indeed, in his time, we do find that the Jews were an absolute influence to all the people, the entire world. In fact, you do see an implementation of it. But other than that, you don't find it. The greatest Jewish thinkers, Maimonides, the Talmudical era, the Mishnaic era, the era of the prophets, the era even the biblical era, you never hear of them trying to teach the nations, trying to make a difference in the world, because they couldn't. Things were too precarious. It would have been dangerous. It would have been absolute kamikaze suicidal behavior to do so. And of course, this is not one of those commandments. This is not one of those missions that require one's self-sacrifice to the point of giving up their life. That's the premise of what the Rebbe makes. But in our times, society has changed. In our times, we do find that although we cannot ignore the facts and reality, there is anti-Semitism out there. But in more modern times, we certainly find that the world has not only opened up and accepted, so to speak, the Jews, and allowed Jews to, so to speak, commingle with them. I don't mean literally, because it's forbidden for Jews to intermarry and so on. But it gave the Jewish people the opportunity, the allowance to finally fulfill their mission. Because it gave us the opportunity and the allowance to finally fulfill the mission, what does that tell us? That we have the obligation to do it. In other words, when God stops us from doing something, not in our imagination, in reality, there was a time, I just want to tell you, there was a time, for example, in Europe, we all know of the Holocaust, which is terrible. But even prior to the Holocaust, Jews couldn't even live where they wanted. You talk about segregation, they couldn't live in certain cities, in the main cities. Even if anybody knows, just as an example, anybody knows Jewish history, you always hear about the shtetls. What does shtetls mean? Shtat in Yiddish, which was the European Jewish language, shtat means city, singular, big, a metropolitan city, a main city. Shtetl is like little, a small city. The Jews could only live in the little cities. Opportunities were obviously more scarce for business, for work, and everything else, and therefore they were impoverished. And I'm talking about in times when it wasn't outright anti-Semitism, such as pogroms, killings, and literally, physically and emotionally and financially harming them directly. But that was the indirect undercurrent of constant anti-Semitism. How then would they go out in such a time and go, by the way, we want to teach you. We want to share some wisdom. Especially the church was so strong and the oppression was just immense and intense. So obviously, I'm only going back in the last few hundred years. The opportunity wasn't there. You go back even some time before that, Jews were constantly moving from one place to another just to have, we're not talking about prosperity, just talking about existence. Whether it was being expelled from one country, being expelled from another country, which again, I don't offer any explanations for why. I don't know. Only God knows. I'm just telling you what. But that what gives us the understanding that for whatever reason, God did not want it yet to be the time, up until you look at the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, when the Rebbe started to talk about it, and he said, now is the time. Now is the time when even, and in a good way, and I must say thanks to this country, with all the challenges we have here, with all the difficulties, but you should know that even going back not that long ago, 60, 70 years ago, it was so uncommon and almost totally rare and impossible to see a Jew walking with a kippah, let alone with a beard. In other words, whatever their choice of observation is. That's not to say a Jew is not wearing a beard is not Jewish or is not religious enough. But with a beard and in their own choice of their traditional garb, whether it be more European, more Polish, more Russian, from whatever ancestry, that was not common. So even though there wasn't overt anti-Semitism, but still there was the undercurrent of intolerance, of lack of acceptance. But that went away. In fact, I don't even feel self-conscious wherever I go, wear a kippah, my beard. This is who I am. And not because I'm so courageous, because it's just no one bothers me. I don't feel a problem. So now is the time. And this is why we're doing it now. And the truth is, I have to be honest with you, the Rebbe was always 30 to 40 to 50 years even ahead of the curve. So if you count the years from the 80s till now, you see suddenly an emergence, a resurgence of A, desire, and B, the fulfillment, the filling of that desire for the Word of God, for what the Torah has to teach. And again, I make that caveat, not conversion, not necessarily to become Jewish, but what is Judaism, which I say is really a euphemism for Godism. What does God have to say to us? He happened to say it through this mouthpiece, through Judaism. And that's what this is all about. I rest my case.